Adrian Romo from Pages and Panels, and today I am so excited to be talking with Ronell Whitaker, an individual who has been using the comic book medium in the classroom. So, a little bit about Ronell. Ronell is a high school English curriculum director in Chicagoland with over 15 years of experience and is a champion for comics in the classroom. He is a founding member of the Lit-X Teacher Cohort. Ronell believes in comics and likes to think that comics believe in him. Ronell, I'm sure they do. Thank you so much for taking time to talk with me today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for even having a conversation with me. This is awesome.
Awesome. Well, the biggest thing that everybody likes to start with any podcast I think I've seen or any sort of conversation is let's talk about your introduction into comics. Where did it start? How did it evolve? Because obviously I see you have a ton of really cool posters behind you. I see an Iron Man poster behind you. So clearly there's a comic fandom there. So how did that start for you?
Yeah, it actually started with my mom. I was a pretty energetic kid, probably dealing with what many people would call, attention deficit at that age. And the one thing that my mom would use to kind of keep me calm, was she would say, "Look, if we go into the store, I'll buy you a comic, or I'll buy you, like a thing to read." Because she used to buy me like the classic illustrated, like anything. I was a voracious reader as a kid, and she grew up reading Archie comics. So she said, "Look, I remember this guy. I know this book is cool, so you check it out." And then she got it for me, man. And I've been reading comics technically since I was 3, because I first started reading the comics pages in newspapers. But yeah, that was it. So like it was like my way to kind of dive in and behave, I guess, was being treated with these comic books. So yeah, my comic origin story is also a mom story, because she was a, kind of an undercover nerd too.
Yeah, you got to give the shout out to the moms who are always like, okay, let me get this for you.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
so that fandom has stayed with you. How has that progressed over the years? Because obviously it started from childhood, but is it something that kind of you always continue to be involved in, or did you kind of take a break from it and kind of pick it up later? Like, what was that like for you?
Yeah, it was literally that. So what happened, like every kid, because I grew up during the boom times of the 90s. So
Hmm.
shout out to the folks who didn't have to experience that, because that was wild, man. I grew up during that time, so that's when X-Men, kind of was resurging. We had the X-Men cartoon at the same time, but also the books were resurging. So I was like a low-key collector, right? At least at that age, 8, 9-year-old collector, getting bags and boards, all that kind of stuff. And I remember when I like fell off of comics for a minute, I remember the exact issue. I forget the number. Because like I read all through the, Superman dies thing, and I was like, okay, this is a little crazy, but all right, I'm still a comic book nerd. And then the Spider-Man issue was like a green foil Spider-Man with like he had like this silver mech suit. And for some reason, my child brain was just like, this is ridiculous. Like we're getting we're getting a little crazy right now. So I
That's
kind of
too funny.
took a break. You know what it is too? Like it kind of coincided with being, a teenager, because at that point it's
Mhm.
like, no, you read serious books now. So like now
Mhm.
I'm that kid walking around reading Catcher in the Rye and all that kind of stuff, which I hated when I read it. But still it was like this is what I have to read. I didn't get back into comics until I went to college, and I, was poor, and I was like, well, I'm not buying anything to read, and I had access to a library, and I, fell in love with 100 Bullets, and like the whole Vertigo line actually brought me. So again, another woman brought me back into comics, Shelley Bond, editor at Vertigo. Like all the stuff she picked was Sandman. What is this? Like it was like this reawakening of like, oh, comics aren't just Deadpool with like and Cable with 5,000 pockets, right? It's these really cool stories. Like it could be slice of life, it can be horror, it can be fantasy. And that was like a nice reawakening. And it coincided with me being in college as an English, for a future English teacher. Because one of the things we talked about a lot was, this literacy problem. And it kind of made me reflect back. Like, I mean, the one thing I was guaranteed to read was comics. And that was like a light bulb moment for me. It was like I got reintroduced back to comics at the same time as I was learning like this craft that was gonna be, really important for me going in the future, like to try to get kids to read. And it started from there again. I've been back in the comics ever since.
No, I think that's great, and that's one of the many great things about the comic book medium is it could be as simplistic or complicated as the creator wants, right? You could have,
Hmm.
and by simplistic I mean more like accessible, like for children,
Hmm.
right? But then you can also have like a very complex and nuanced story that has a lot of themes and commentary. So I think you're right. Like comics are a perfect way to get somebody into reading because you can kind of find a track that works for them. Um, and kind of get them hooked into just experiencing a story outside of television. Um, so now you've gotten back into it into college, which going to the library, I love that that's how you got introduced. I think that's kind of the way it was for me. There were like kind of Silver Age DC trades at my library that I would check
Hmm.
out. Um, and of course, what's awesome is not a lot of people, y'all should go to the library, but not as many people use the library. So I would walk out with like a stack of trades
Yeah,
and just like
exactly.
binge them all. And I was like, this is free? I was like, I get to experience all of it. So I definitely know exactly where you're coming from. I was very similar. There was a library near my college during my undergrad. Um, but you've used comics now, fast forwarding in your career as a teacher. You've used comics in the classroom. So how did that essentially sort of evolve? Because obviously it was something you were a fan of and you love the storytelling. How did that change afterwards?
Yeah, so I got my first job right out of college, at a school on the west side of Chicago. And again, I had that kernel in the back of my brain saying, this is this could be a way to hook kids in. And I still didn't know. I was still battling with that, classic training of, comics aren't real reading, even though I knew that wasn't true. So I started with trying to find like really quote unquote legitimate ways to use it in the classroom that wouldn't get me dinged by an administrator. So I'll never forget it. It started with a grammar lesson, and I was being observed with this lesson. I purposely chose this to kind of say like, hey, look, this is valid, right? Um, so I had to teach, like sentence structure or sentence and paragraph structure. Instead of having my kids, rewrite paragraphs and put them in the correct order, I cut up comic strips from the Boondocks. And I had them first say, okay, I gave them like a full week run so they could say like, okay, this is the order that it should go from Monday to Friday, like if they follow a complete story. But also I cut the panels up. So we had to figure out, okay, which each panel is like a sentence. And
Mm.
then they had to go, okay, I got that sentence together. Now I got to figure out where does it go in the order of the five, panels. And I use
Oh,
that to
that's
teach.
clever. That's like detective work in the
Yeah,
classroom. I
yeah. But
love
like
that. And
it
Boondocks is a
made
great
them,
series too.
yes, and it made them close read. Like it did all the things that we want them to do, right? They were learning coherence and unity as a writing principle, but they also had to read very closely for like detail and inference, all those things in one 50-minute class period. And when my principal saw it, she was like, "Oh, that was really cool. And you use this thing, that I would not have ever thought of." And I was like, "Yeah, see, this is valid." And that's when I started to kind of like get the itch, like, okay, you let me do this. How
Hmm.
about can I now teach with a comic book instead of like um shocking her system by saying like, "Hey, let me use Amazing Spider-Man" or something like that.
Yeah.
I said, you know what? Like I had like my freshmen, they call it at risk at that point. But those are the kids who tended to have some literacy issues or whether it was like they were not on track to pass, all that kind of stuff. So I said, all right, look, I had this really cool adaptation of Kafka's Metamorphosis, that's a graphic novel. Can I use that? And she was like, yeah, as long as I have to pay for it, I don't care. I said, all right, cool. So I bought like 30 copies of that thing, man. And I read Kafka's Metamorphosis with a bunch of quote unquote at-risk freshmen. And once they got past like, oh, this dude turned into a roach, they were like, oh, this is a really cool story. And
Hmm.
like, I don't know if you've ever talked to, a 13 or 14-year-old. They ain't trying to read Metamorphosis, man. Like that's not a
Hmm.
thing they want to do. But they read this. My kids read it and they dug into it and they wrote about it. And it was like another light bulb. Like, okay, so not only did I get kids to engage in a material that was possibly higher than their level, but they understood it. They were able to write about it, and I got through it faster than like if I had tried to do Of Mice and Men for like 8 weeks. Right? We read Metamorphosis in like a week, and like now I was just spending time on the writing process and the teaching, and I think that was that thing I was able to kind of throw at people and say, like, look, I saved time. I still got to where I needed to go. And my kids
Mhm.
were engaged. And the bonus is like my kids trust me now. Because they're like,
Yeah.
okay, he's not gonna do the thing that everybody else does and make me read a thing. Even though I did. I made them read a thing,
Yeah, yeah,
but they
yeah.
but they felt like, oh, this is a little bit more, you know, if not engaging, at least more interesting than what I used to have to read all the time. And that was it, man. It was from there. I just been sprinkling them in, left and right, and I've since then I've gone on to use Ultimate Spider-Man in my classroom, and
Hmm.
other adaptations like Beowulf, and there's never been a time where I didn't have a comic in my class where like kids knew they were going to read at least one graphic novel for part of their, capstone learning in my class.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think what's even better is, I mean, students talk. So if you
Hmm.
think about it, like a freshman student could be talking to a sophomore who was in your class, and they could say, "Yeah, we got to read this really cool comic as part of it." And even something like that can be exciting to kids because, like, oh, I get to read a comic in high school. That's pretty cool. Um, so that's very genius. I love that. So I know you're an English teacher, but did you ever have students, this is kind of sidetracking, but did you ever have students kind of see the potential in other skills that they had, like either in lettering or in the art or coloring, as they were reading comics that kind of maybe opened up doors for them that they were like, oh, I didn't realize that I love to draw and there's a way for me to kind of be an artist. Did any of your students ever talk to you about something like that as you were reading the comics?
Not only as I was reading, but like once I got deep into my career, I started having
Mhm.
kids actually write comics.
Oh,
Some
that's
of it
so awesome.
would be as simple as like, hey, here's another story that we read after. So like we would read August Wilson's Fences. It's like, okay, let's take this act or this scene and turn that into a comic or a graphic novel.
Oh, that's so cool. So you'd have like
And
the
it
kids
was,
like one would be the writer, one would be the artist and all that.
yeah. Yeah. So like
Oh,
some
that's
kids were like,
awesome.
hey, can I have this job? Can I be the artist, or can I be the writer on this one? Or can I just, be the person that says, hey, look, I want to storyboard this out and I'll do both things myself. And I kind of talk to kids about like it doesn't have to be this crazy, insane, like detailed art. It just has to get across the idea. Like we read books with varying degrees of art skill in my class, and kids got to see that there was a bunch of different ways they can go through it. And then I had those kids too who were like low key becoming comic book nerds through stuff like your webtoons, and
Hmm.
some of the kids were kind of pirating their manga. So they were like, oh, there's a bunch of ways that I could be in this community, and it doesn't have to just be um as a writer
Western
or
comics. Hmm.
yes, yeah. And what was really great, what I learned over time, especially with like indie comics specifically, um, is that unlike reading Catcher in the Rye, which I brought up earlier, like that dude's dead. He is dead. I don't know. Maybe he's not. But like a lot of those like older writers are like those are dead people who we will never get to interact with, and we're making all these assumptions about who these people are.
Hmm.
Versus, these comic creators. I've had kids reach out to comic creators and never respond back, and they feel like they just talk to us to like a superhero. They're
A
like,
celebrity, yeah.
yeah. And it's like, yeah, that person's alive and you just made their day by reaching out and saying that we're learning about the comics in the classroom and you want to talk to them about it. So like
Yeah.
just that idea that comics feels like more and manga too feel like more of a living medium for kids, and they feel attainable because a lot of kids we shove the classics down their throat, and in some
Hmm.
ways those are written at such a high level, but in not just like language wise, just skill wise, structure wise, it's like that is amazing because we only let them read the best, right, quote unquote best. But when they read a comic, it's like I can do that. Like my friend does my friend draws all the time. I could do this thing. And it's for the first time like a kid gets to see themselves as a writer or as a creator. And I think like that is a powerful gift to give kids to say like this is democracy. Anybody can do this stuff. None
Hmm.
of this stuff should be kept from you. If you have a story you want to tell, you don't have to be, James Joyce. You can be, you know, another creator. You could be Rodney Barnes, who I love right now, right?
Hmm.
You could be any of these
Ronnie
people.
Barnes is awesome.
Yeah, he's amazing. But like you could be any of these folks. And I try to also use comics as a way to like show those diverse voices too. Um,
Hmm.
A, because I'm aware of all the a lot of diverse voices in that medium more than um traditional media, but also it's just like easier to say, like, yeah, I can put this book from Stephanie Williams in front of you way easier. And probably like show you like, hey, she liked the tweet that I made tweet. That was how long ago. But like it's just
Hmm.
really cool to show the kids that this is an accessible way to get your story out there and look at who's doing it. These are folks who look like you or who have similar experiences to you versus, our Steinbecks, I love Steinbeck, but like yeah, man, that dude's dead and ain't gonna be anything like what your life was like. So
Yeah. No, I think that's amazing. And I mean, what's especially awesome is I can only imagine the sort of compound effect of your work decades from now when someone is potentially goes into creating comic books and there's a surge in, like I said, authentic voices out there telling news stories, personal stories, from their own experiences. So I'm very excited. I'll definitely be staying in touch with you because I'm very curious how that looks like years from now. Have you had any students who have kind of branched out and started doing like at least self-publishing, or is it still kind of like they're probably still at an age where they're either like in college or kind of figuring it out?
well, no, I've been teaching since 2005. So I have some kids who are in, that they're trying to make their own film. Some kids who are
Oh,
like,
that's
yeah, I
awesome.
absolutely want to go into like writing comics. Some kids are writers. Some kids are like, I'm a comic. Like they went into creative realms. And then you have some kids who are like, yeah, I just want to still be a fan. I ran into a
Yeah.
kid at C2E2, like a kid. I call them kids because they are my kids forever. I ran into a full-grown adult at a comic convention here, and it was like so cool to see that their fandom carried on beyond my classroom. It was like this thing where they saw it legitimized, and they're like, "Oh well, if he can do it, then you can definitely. This is the real thing." Now I'm an
Yeah.
administrator, so I'm not in the classroom as much anymore. Um, but last year, I helped to bring in. So we have every year seniors read graphic novels, and some write their own scripts, stuff like that in our classes. And last year we got to take about 80 kids to a comic convention this year.
Oh, that's
Um,
so fun.
and we had well, it's like 60, and we had like eight of those kids on a panel. So they got to be on their first, like they were professionals. They had presenter badges and they got to have microphones, and I moderated that panel, and I was just so proud to see like these kids from my district speaking and being heard as like experts in the field because they just lived through what it was like to learn using comics, and people had some really good questions for them, so it was really cool to kind of see that was a good full circle moment for me.
That's really amazing. Yeah, and I didn't even think about the fact that if you've been teaching for 15 years, I mean, at a certain point when they have kids, they're going to start getting their kids into the medium and then their
Yeah.
kids. So there's a whole wave of comic book fans, thanks just to you. So I think the comic book industry should give you an award for that, for keeping the industry afloat.
Yeah,
So
look,
everybody always
me and
says
my
comic book medium's dying, and I'm like, I don't see how. There's a lot of fans out there. My LCS is always busy.
yeah,
And
mine
it's a
too.
lot of different people there too, which is great.
Yeah, and what we're doing, I belong to that cohort Lit-X. We're trying to grow it. We're trying to be like nationwide. Like more teachers should be using not just comics, but nerdy pop culture in general because it's
Hmm.
becoming a part of the monoculture in a lot of ways. Like, let's
Hmm.
capitalize on it. I've been trying to talk to like not just the big three, but like all publishers. Like, y'all need to really capitalize on this moment because
Yeah,
now you have kids who want the thing. Like they want it. They want these comics. They want more of these stories. So like get into it. And they're starting to listen. You have, of course, your DCs and Marvels are gonna try to capitalize and they're making inroads. But like we got all these other, publication houses are like, yeah, I want some of that money. And there's a reason why Raina Telgemeier is, so massive as a creator because it's like, yeah, kids love comics. Kids love that stuff. Kids love Phoebe and her unicorn. Like that's another amazing book that's like, yeah, this is a kind of a small pressish thing that kind of blew up and became something else. And now, like, you know, Dana is this amazing creator who has gotten her comics in the hands of kids that might not have, if not for
Hmm.
folks trying to say, like, yeah, let these kids read these books. They're real, you know?
Definitely. So you've answered a lot of my questions so far. So let me take a quick second here. So as you've talked about it, you've used it in a variety of different ways. You've talked about looking at grammar, sentence structure. How have you seen from when the students come into your class? Because obviously students are going to grow from beginning of the semester to the end of the semester. How have you seen that change over the entire course of a school year when a student goes from just being a casual reader, or maybe not even reading that much, especially when they're teenagers, um, to the end of the year? Do you see like a difference? What difference? I'm sure you do, but what differences do you see in terms of media literacy, being able to understand nuances and storytelling? Like, what does that look like? Because I'm sure that's fascinating to see by the end of the year.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big things that we talk about a lot, and I keep saying we because I belong to a group of folks who go around kind of weirdly evangelizing about this. But one of the things
Hmm.
that we really harp on people with is the speed at which we can get to skills faster,
Mm.
and then we can help to mediate those things and kind of say, like, if this kid's not understanding the thing, we can get there faster through a medium that's more accessible, right? But also the thing outside of a skill window that I've noticed with kids all the time is confidence. It's that confidence of like, I know I can do this thing because I showed I could do it when we were reading about Miles Morales. And Miles
Hmm.
Morales ain't that different from Romeo as far as characters. Like if we're talking about just how to characterize something or how to talk about what an author does when they're writing, it's the same
Hmm.
thing. And that transferability is like a key component that we key in on a lot. So like those kids, by the time they get to the end of the year, they're doing the things we want them to do because they did it in what they thought was a more low stakes, environment when they were just like playing, quote unquote, right? It's like, oh yeah, I know about Morales. I'm reading this book about Spider-Man, and what can we write an essay about it? I mean, I guess if that's what you want me to do, but I'll do it. And they do it because
Hmm.
they feel like I'm writing about Spider-Man. Like that's not a real essay. Let me just write this thing. And it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, you see this thing you just wrote about Spider-Man. Now let's do that
Hmm.
now about Troy from Fences. And it's like, okay, got it. Like I've had
Yeah.
kids tell me a thing where I'm like trying to teach them a skill and they go, oh, that's what you meant? Why didn't you just say that in the first place? Because I use comics to do it instead of like some other thing. And it's like, all right, thanks. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But I
20
mean,
years of teaching.
but I mean, it speaks to the fact that it's a very obvious statement, but every kid's different,
Yeah.
and sometimes it isn't necessarily, and this is just my opinion popping out. I don't necessarily think it's necessarily that the foundations of learning are there, obviously, like there's the principles that you have to reinforce, sure. But I think how you get there, I feel like for the longest time there was an assumption on how you had to do that. And
Hmm.
so I really appreciate the fact that you're taking a medium that you're a fan of and using that to kind of open these other paths for students to get the same skills and principles and understanding and reinforce it, but just in a different way. Because again, not kids don't learn the same. You of all people, I'm sure know that.
Yeah.
So I think that's amazing that you're doing that. As you've picked comics, how are you? I know you sent me a list. I unfortunately did not get a chance to read as many because, like I said, the whole hurricane thing. Um, but if you want to kind of give a couple of shout outs to a few of them, how have you kind of picked which titles you want to highlight? How does that typically work? You gave a pretty impressive list here. So let's start with the first one. So obviously there's March by John Lewis. That one's amazing. I've seen that one. That's the civil rights book. Um, how have you kind of picked that? Have there been any pushbacks with any of the comics that you presented, or have you been fortunate enough to just kind of have a free for all?
Yeah. So I initially when I was still in the classroom, my boss at the time approached me about using comics in the classroom like early on. He's like, hey, I got money. What do you want me to buy for you? And like that ethos kind of
That's
carried
every
on.
teacher's favorite thing to hear. I got
Yeah.
money. Where do you want me to spend it?
Yeah, seriously. And it's one of those things that I carried over when I took over his job as the boss of the department. I was like, yeah, man, whatever y'all want to do, I want to support it and also kind of like guide you to do even better with that. So for me, it was just like a thing where I said, okay, I want to pick books that, like it's like the famous mirrors, windows, and sliding doors, right? That, and I'm looking for. I can never remember who said that, um, but it's about this idea that any text that you put in front of kids, they should either see themselves represented there, see, a view into another identity or world that they don't have access to, and maybe even walk through a door to more fully experience that. And I've
Mm,
always looked at comics as the best medium to do that. And March is insanely good at that because it's a clear sliding door. It's a clear way to kind of not only see an experience, but like John Lewis and Andrew Iden and Nate Powell like put the readers in the civil rights movement experience in a way that I don't think I've ever felt in a book before, not even in a history textbook.
mhm.
And that was a really powerful opportunity. I thought. I thought it spoke volumes that those three folks, John Lewis, chief among them, thought that the best way to reach everyone would be through the graphic novel medium. And he had evidence of that because he grew up with the Montgomery story. It was a comic that was written about the Selma bus boycotts. And it was like, hey, we need to find a way to communicate this idea to as many people as we can. Some of them not very literate. What can we do to do that? Comics. And I think the fact that John Lewis took that ethos and said, I'm going to carry that to like the ninth power and reach a ton of people and show them what good trouble is and that whole philosophy of like, how do you stand up for what's right in a way that is very concrete. I thought that that was like a great way to start because no matter what, I want kids to have access to a multitude of ideas, but also I want them to be empowered to see that they can you know, make a larger change than what they may think that they're capable of. And that was why I started with that book.
That's a great one. So you also mentioned Something Terrible by Dean Tripp. I
Yeah,
don't know if you
something
want to talk about
terrible.
this one a bit.
So, if anyone who's been in an English class in this country, at least in the North America, English teachers have this really bad rep of picking tragic stories, and it's because we
I
know that
hadn't thought of it that way, but yeah, you're right. Now that I think of my
it's
high school
because
days,
like
yeah, they're all depressing.
oh, it's rough, man. It's rough. Like everybody dies in our classroom.
Everybody dies, yeah.
And it's because like we're trying to find ways to hook kids in, and we know that like at that age, especially high school kids, like they only like the drama, they only
Hmm.
like that kind of stuff. And I say that as a set of something terrible because something terrible is a really actually powerful story of how Dean Tripp used you know, comics, Batman is specific, but superheroes to kind of combat his own childhood traumas. It's a powerful, powerful story. I read it as like an electronic book or whatever, or like electronic short story. And I ended up buying a bunch of copies, using it in my classroom. It's completely wordless. So like I have kids use that to like practice inferencing into how to discuss a book that has a really deep message without like a lot of words, and they're still
Hmm.
practicing their literacy skills, but it's just visual literacy. So it's like
Mm.
a difficult book that's packaged in a way that's simple, right?
Oh, that's
Um,
awesome.
it's really good, man. I don't want to spoil like what fully happens, but like it's a great story, and my kids walk away from it um having experienced what the writer experienced, but also understanding like, oh, so not only can these books be like a good way for me to learn some things, but it can be a way because I use that as a jumping off point as like creativity as a way to like deal with stuff. I can use
Hmm.
it as a way to communicate ideas that are not just about superheroes. So that's really cool. Like short text too. I don't know if Dean Tripp has anything more recent now, but that was one that like I used a lot in the classroom.
Yeah, and it's very amazing how you're using these different range of titles. So obviously you mentioned this one has limited text. I imagine there's one that's probably a little more wordy for when maybe your students feel a little more confident. Um, so and you gave me a full list that I'll definitely have to include in the article and in the show notes as well. So I don't want to have to go through all of them because I have a
Yeah,
few more
no.
questions. But as you've kind of moved from the classroom and you're now in that administrative role, how have you kind of are you still able to sort of not like reinforce, but kind of ensure that the comic book medium is still being used? Is that something that other
Mhm.
teachers have seen and said, hey, I want to mirror that? Like, what does that look like amongst your peers, especially now that you're on the admin side? You've obviously
Yeah.
done this work already, but what does that look like from that, I guess, future standpoint?
Yeah, it's funny, as a classroom teacher, um, I kind of became known as the comic book guy. It's kind of where my Instagram name comes
Hmm.
from
Yeah, that makes sense.
because yeah, because they would, kind of like jokingly go, "Oh, you're the comic book guy." Like the kids told me they're reading X, Y, and Z in your classroom, or some of my closer friends would kind of prank me and say, "Hey, go ask, Mr. Whitaker, who will win in a fight, Batman or Superman." And I would engage that kid in that argument. But also, right, it would always be like this thing where they were kind of like, "Oh, he's using these comics."
Hmm.
As the years went on, though, and they would, see that my kids were productive, my kids would come to their classrooms talking about what I was doing, and that I was getting results. They started asking me like, "Hey, what could I do? Like, how could I bring a comic in?" Or, "Hey, can
Mm.
you recommend some books?" So when I became the head of my department, not only was I the person they were asking about that, but it's funny, people want to kind of impress their bosses, and they're like, "Look, hey, I used this comic in my class," right? And it became this thing where it's now just accepted practice in my district that
Hmm.
kids are not only going to read graphic novels, because I was also the head of the LRC, so I helped to buy books for our library, LRC's library.
Mm.
Um, so we had like a big injection of comics into our libraries. Now kids can go there and they go, "Oh, this is what I can do," and we have our literacy classes will allow kids to read comics in their classes, and it just kind of mushroomed. So now that it's almost like it's the expectation that I'm gonna be looking to see, hey, did you incorporate? Even though I'm not, like, I'm not. There is nothing on a rubric that I'm gonna say, hey, did they use comics in the classroom? But it is a thing
Hmm.
where they know that I think it's important and that they've seen the results, they've seen it bear fruit. And not only that, but like now your AP tests are starting to catch up, and your SATs are like, hey, we're gonna use this panel from Mouse, right? Like
Hmm.
it's become
Hmm.
this thing where they're like, oh, this guy was ahead of the curve. We should start embracing this a lot more. And like at every level, kids read a comic in my English curriculum, my English department, like at every level, freshman, sophomore, senior, junior, like they have at least one exposure to graphic novels. And that's part of the work that, myself and my friend Eric, who's um, at comics underscore teacher. So we have some similar things going. That's a result of the work that we did. Now folks are it's just a given that you're going to read a graphic novel in our, school. And like I said, we have an entire uh, class that is just dedicated to reading comics in our classes now. So it's been really interesting to kind of see that influence kind of spread in a good way.
Now you've talked about the Lit-X group. Can you talk a
Yeah.
little bit more about that? Because you said it's kind of this cohort of teachers.
Yeah. Yeah. We are a group of teachers who are adept at using pop culture in the classroom. So we use
Mm.
graphic novels, we use, of course, film, music, gaming, all that kind of stuff. And it's not just in the way of like, hey, we're gonna have this treat for the kids. It's in a very real, pedagogically sound way. Some ways it's like we're going to devote entire lessons to it. Some ways it's embedded through what we do as teachers. And in some ways it's just as simple as like processes. Like a friend of mine likes to use a 20-sided die as like a decision making tool,
Mm.
right? And like, so the kids will he'll let a kid come up and say, all right, we're going to do questions 1 through 20. I want you to roll a die to let us know which one we're going to be doing. And it's like,
Oh, that's cool.
and it's just like stuff like that, just small ways to kind of capitalize on the zeitgeist at large, but like just what kids are into. At a one, one of my friends in the cohort, you gamified their entire class. Like kids would have classes. Like they like think of it like Bard and Barbarian, but like more of like a space thing. It's like, hey,
Hmm.
you are the ranger class and you are the medic, and like you they have different roles they do in the classroom, and they're on teams and they gain points, and it's like all this different ways you can like incorporate this stuff, and we're all about like just getting the word out that this is a pedagogically sound way to engage kids and build like a really cool classroom environment that'll have kids, being responsive to what you're trying to teach. Like it's just another way to infuse some cultural responsiveness into your teaching.
Yeah, and if kids are excited about class, I mean, I imagine they perform better. I imagine they, again, get skills that they keep with them, and especially reading skills. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you talk about your students who may not necessarily be the strongest readers. I mean, reading is critical to everything, right? You can't do anything if you can't read very well.
Yeah,
There's regardless of what industry you go in, there's going to be some level of understanding. It's going to be written down. You got to figure it out. So I think it's super important. My mother-in-law is actually a second grade teacher, and she always talks about how that's kind of what keeps her motivated because it's rough for teachers, I hear.
it
So
is.
props to you for doing it for 15 years. It's always great to hear that there's teachers in there who have been able to be part of it for so long, and I'm glad you're in the administrative role to kind of help encourage other teachers. But my mother-in-law is always talking about how that reading foundation is really what keeps her motivated. So has the fusion of comics sort of kind of helped you stay motivated as a teacher? I mean, obviously you're very passionate about teaching because you're clearly thinking of new ways to be engaging, but has the incorporation of comics kind of helped that kind of extra oomph of excitement for you? Because obviously it does for the kids, but how has that been for your experience?
Yeah, you have to be excited about what you teach because if you're not excited, then the kids won't be excited. So when you are clearly a fan of the thing that you're doing, then the kids are going to love it too. Uh, one of the principles that we have in Lit-X is you should be a fan of what you do, but don't hug yourself to the point where it's like, I would be hurt if a kid doesn't like this thing, right?
Hmm.
Your excitement should be not about the thing, the book that they're reading or whatever it is. Your excitement should be about I'm welcoming y'all into this world of comics, this world of pop culture, this world of gaming. So where you can see like how you can transfer it around. And if you don't like this book, that's totally fine. There may be something else within this world that you'll find that's good for you though. And that's what we really like try to hit home is that it's not about like, you're going to try to use Magic the Gathering in your classroom. If that one kid doesn't like it, then this whole thing failed. It's about, hey,
Hmm.
that one kid just doesn't like Magic the Gathering. It's okay. Nobody, says that this thing was a failure when that one kid didn't like Moby Dick. Like they go, no, we're going to
Hmm.
keep using Moby Dick, right? So if that one kid doesn't like Spider-Man, I don't get mad about that. It's like, yeah, I get it. This is not for everybody. But hey, maybe we can find the one thing that is for you. And what I've again, that speed thing keeps hitting in my head. Like I could have a kid read a quick 2-page preview of like a bunch of graphic novels, but they wouldn't do that for a novel. It'd just be like, yeah, I'm done with this. I'm not doing this. So
Hmm.
it's fun things where like if I love the thing I'm doing, the kids just they they may go like, you know what, I don't like Spider-Man, but this dude's really into this stuff. He's probably gonna find something that I'm gonna like. And it
Yeah.
always happens. It happens that way all the time.
And there's a range of titles to pick from. Because like I said, you gave a very impressive list that I think covers a different group of genres, topics, all that. So I imagine there's a wealth of titles that you can really pick from. But kind of as we've been talking, a question popped in my head, kind of going back to when you first started. Um, what misconceptions about comic books did you have to sort of get around? Like, did parents provide any pushback, or did you said the administration was pretty open to it because again, it wasn't any additional cost. But did you have any pushback initially? Like, how was that sort of, or did people just kind of say, "Hey, you're doing this," which would be great, but how was that at the beginning?
No,
Especially considering people associate comics as like, "Oh, you only read comics as a kid," and it's like, well, there's
yeah.
so many different titles that have different complex stories and art and all that. So how was that originally?
The pushback I always got was from other teachers. It was never from parents.
Mm,
It was never from kids. It was always other teachers. And I don't say that lightly, but I also don't say that to belittle anybody else. I know that it's hard to overcome programming. There was one
hmm
book on that list. It's called I Kill Giants. That
hmm
very early on in my career I wanted to use, and I ran it by an administrator who was also a former English teacher, and he just said, "Absolutely not. You can't use this. Um, I wouldn't allow this book, in my classrooms." And I just waited him out. And I got another boss, and I said, "Hey, what about this book?" And he said, "All right, yeah, give it a shot," because he was, really really cool boss. He's like, "Yeah, let's give it a shot. If it fails, it fails. At least you try the thing." And I tried it, and kids loved it. And I actually had that's the one book that kind of makes me sad in a lot of ways because I often taught it to seniors, and I would have it would never fail. It's like at least one or two kids say this is the first book I actually read in high school.
mm,
And it would make me sad because it's like I know what those previous 3 years, like I know what you were supposed to have been doing. So that means you missed a bunch of books you did not read, and you made it
yeah.
to fourth year, and you finally read a book and loved it, but you finally like read a book. And I just imagine like what would have happened in freshman year if you've gotten a hold of like a book that made you go, "Oh, books aren't that bad because this is good," right? Like
hmm
what would have happened if more teachers had just gotten out of their own way? And instead of saying, because when we talk about like people who say like comics are for kids, it's rarely the parent who does that. I mean, there are parents because, of course, right? There are parents who think that. But my experience with parents has always been, wait, you got my kid to read a whole book?
hmm
Like that's what it's been every single time. Like they want to come and meet me and meet the teacher night because they're like, hey, my kid came home saying you're gonna be reading Spider-Man. Is that true? And I say, yeah, and we're gonna be reading all these other books too, but that's like a gateway. And they're like, look, I don't care what the gateway is. You're getting my kid to read these books,
Yeah.
go for it.
Yeah.
And like I said, it was always the other teachers who were kind of like fighting against their own program and they kind of go like, well, that's not real reading. And the other librarians would say that too. But then it's like, look, man, look at your checkout rate. Like, what are they checking out? What are they actually reading? Like, what do
hmm
they actually want to read? We have to get to a point where we give them not only sugar with the medicine, but just make the medicine more palatable, right? Like
Yeah.
make the thing that they want to do so we can treat the problems. And I think that's where we kind of landed with that.
That's amazing. That's a bummer that the teachers gave the biggest pushback. But like you said, I mean, I think when, especially if somebody's been in a profession for years, it is hard to kind of, I guess, shift gears. So I could see
Yeah.
how I mean, and that's in any industry, in any role, right? Like someone who's been doing something for a while, change is inevitably hard, especially if it's something that's completely different.
Mhm.
Um, Now, were you primarily a freshman teacher, or because you said you had some students who didn't like read I Kill Giants till their senior year? Like, you're a high school teacher, but did you kind of shift grades, or
Yeah,
because
I
you mentioned freshman teaching for a while?
for a long time I was a freshman English teacher, a
hmm
freshman slash freshman who were at risk teacher. And then towards the end of my classroom tenure, I started with this class that was called Man, Myth, Monster that I used as a way to make it more of a graphic novel class. And that kind of preceded our graphic novel course that we had as a senior elective. So
hmm
I mainly have freshmen. I like teaching freshmen. It's like, the way that our district works is if someone is has an affinity for something, we try to like to say, hey, you stay with that thing until you're ready to not do it. And I like freshmen. I did not like a lot of the other class levels. Um, it was cool to kind of like get them when they're fresh and early. And
hmm
also just to, I just like that age. But when I got to seniors, I love teaching seniors too because they are closer to that adult age. You can have different conversations with them, but also they have the benefit of like looking back and saying what they would have done differently or what they would have done better. And their approach to learning is a little bit different than freshmen. So it was cool to kind of teach them with the graphic novel stuff too.
So. going forward, right? You're now in the administrative role. How are you kind of long term envisioning comics to continue to be part of the classroom? I know you're also open to when teachers want to use gamification, which I think is another great idea, but
Mhm.
focusing more on comics, how are you kind of envisioning that going forward? What are your kind of plans with that? Or have you kind of just developed enough of a framework that you're like, hey, I'm just going to let this kind of, you know, play out and kind of jump in as necessary?
Yeah, what we've done so far is we've made it a part of the culture. And I think that's
Hmm.
what I'm trying to do, not only locally, but outside of my own school. Because again, through Lit-X and my work with publishers like Penguin Random House, I've written a lot of, teacher guides for them. We go around the country talking at different comic conventions, talking about this kind of stuff. I think
Hmm.
the goal is to first shift the culture around comics and just say that, hey, these are legitimate ways to teach. But long term, my goal is to move away from culture and just make it embedded, to be a thing that is just expected in what we do. There's this, talk about being more culturally responsive to the kids that are in front of you. And I think we need to recognize that pop culture, comics being a part of that, is, for better or worse, it's a part of being a culturally responsive teacher. You have to say, this is a part of what kids value. This is a part of what this is the art of their day, right? So why
Hmm.
not tap into that stuff, um, and treat it with the seriousness that it deserves? If a kid is able to talk about lumberjanes in a very specific, very academic way, if a kid can break down the hero's journey in Dragon Ball Z, although it would take them
Hmm.
30,000 years because that thing ain't done. But like, if a if a kid can do that, then who am I to say that that's not valid? Like,
Yeah.
it's the same frameworks. And again, if you validate what a kid sees as valuable, and you say that too is worth study, and you say that your culture is just as important, whether it's comics, whether it is your local culture, your family culture, your ethnic, all that kind of stuff, that stuff is valid, then it means that, oh, well, then I can be an invested member of your learning community too, because my ideas are being shown the same care as this book that is 400 to 500 years old. um, then that means that you also value me as a person. And I think that that's what we're trying to do, is get it beyond just saying that their comics are okay, to comics are a part of what we do because they are a part of what's important to our culture as a whole.
That's amazing. Well, yeah, this has been such an enlightening and amazing and very inspiring conversation. I have a 2 year old at home, and my wife and I always talk about how we're trying to get her into reading. And right now, luckily, we've introduced her to picture books, but already she loves Spider-Man. Um, like I don't know what it is about Spider-Man. Don't get me wrong, Spider-Man's great, but she loves Spider-Man. So I bought her this. I would say it's like a young adult, or maybe even like more kid-friendly Spider-Man graphic novel. And even though she can't read yet because she's only 2, like she's looking through it and
Yeah,
she's saying like, "Oh, Spider-Man's jumping," or "Oh, Spider-Man's with this animal," and it's like I think it's just amazing that the medium has the ability to be in people's lives at different stages and sort of it can grow with them. It's a medium that I think can grow with a
yeah.
lot of people. And so I think what you're doing is amazing. And it's very inspiring to hear all the work that you're doing, especially because like you said, there's the whole next generation of readers. I mean, from a fandom standpoint, we need more comic book readers because that's how we get more amazing stories, more amazing creators, but it also benefits students because now they're seeing a whole different world that they can explore. So what you're doing is amazing, and now I'm very happy I was able to talk with you. Um, so is there a way for people to maybe kind of support your district, your classroom? I know sometimes teachers kind of have like those lists of like, hey, here's some titles that people can kind of pick up. Maybe you want to give a shout out to that,
You know,
or how can people kind of support what you're doing, even just following you on social media and spreading the word about it?
I would say the first step is to follow me on social media. We're starting something with Lit-X
Hmm.
that we're hoping is going to eventually really benefit teachers really soon. But one of the big questions we've been trying to answer is for folks is how do we get more comics in our classroom? Because not everybody is in a district that is as supportive as mine.
Hmm.
And we're trying to find more of those ways to say, okay, how can we kind of subsidize or help folks? So that work's coming soon. So yeah, follow me on Instagram at the comic book teacher. And then that'll be like your way to get to all of my Lit-X folks, as well as there's a bunch of organizations out there that are trying stuff. Um, one that comes to mind that I like is Comics for Kids. They're actually really cool. They
Hmm.
take like Lucy's donated single issues and they give them
Hmm.
out to like kids in hospitals, stuff like that. So yeah, if you follow me, I try to amplify stuff like that, and find ways to, support that stuff. Because my kids don't need it, honestly. Like I spend money freely on that kind of stuff for my kids. But yeah, we're working towards supporting that right now.
Yeah, and I think the other great thing that I know we're almost at time here is you're also really good about promoting Kickstarters, highlighting different authors to follow. So that's actually how I stumbled across your social media. I forgot which creator it was, but you're like, oh, this is a comic book creator to follow, and I was like, oh, this is really cool. And I went to your page and I was like, oh, this is an immediate follow.
Oh,
Like I
cool.
love the work that you're doing. It's I think it's been like a year now, but yeah. Well, Ronell, thank you so much for talking with me. This has been, like I said, amazing and inspiring, and I look forward to staying in touch and hearing more about all the ways in which you hear that your impact is just like I said, compounding further down the line. So thank you again for taking time to talk with me.
Thank you so much for having me, Seth. I appreciate it.
Yeah, take care.